Good morning, everyone. I am Catalin Lungu, the REHVA president, and I will open this morning session of the Brussels summit of our federation. I will start saying that this is a special day. After another special day we celebrated a few days ago. You probably, all of you know that on 8th of November, we had a special event, the World Ventilation Day. A very new event supported by more than 20 notorious bodies of researchers and professional practitioners, all passionate about ventilation, about clean air inside buildings, wanting to raise awareness about the importance of the ventilation in buildings. I said today it's a special day because we will reach today exactly 8 billion people on Earth, and all them need proper food, need clean energy, need clean air. They need also shelters. Taking into account the COVID-19 pandemic, taking into account also the war of at our European borders, I can say that our mission is not easy, and to add, let's say, more pressure on all of us, I look at the figures for the future showing that in 2050 we will reach 10 billion people on Earth, and also the fact that we will need around 13,000 buildings to accommodate the population, the new population, to accommodate human activities, in fact, accommodate 90% of our living lives. I was asked a few days ago during an interview, what REHVA does in order to tackle the energy crisis? How do we play our leading role in the very complicated geopolitical and energetic context? And I explained that we don't directly save energy. Of course, in our homes, at the office, all of us save energy and save resources. But we are engineers, we are architects, we are scientists and practitioners taking care of real and technical and feasible solutions for the energy consumption reduction, for the cut down of CO2 emissions, and also for the increase of renewable energy sources uses in buildings. Coming back to our agenda today, we will tackle very actual topics, zero emission buildings, and one of the most important European Commission program, REPowerEU. We will have two sections. The first one, it will be moderated by myself. And in the second part of the day, there will be a discussion. There are several presentations scheduled, and there will be also a discussion about the same REPowerEU and building decarbonization, the path between dreams and reality. I will refer further only to EPBD, so you know probably that REHVA followed very closely this topic. We released 5 position papers starting from March 2021, and the last one was released in July 2022. I will end my short speech for the opening of this REHVA summit, kindly asking all the speakers to stick to the scheduled program. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this first day, of the first half of the day. Maybe we can accept one exception because we have a very special guest today, and he needs to leave right after his speech. We can take 1 or maximum 2 questions for Mr. Bușoi. But before that, I have, of course, it's my duty to express my gratitude first to the REHVA team organizing this event. Then, of course, to our member associations and supporters making possible to have our federation. And, of course, finally, to our guests who accepted to present and to tackle the main topics in Europe, but not only in Europe. So the first speaker is Mr. Cristian-Silviu Bușoi, member of the European Parliament and chair of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, known also as ITRE Committee. Mr. Bușoi is a contributor to many plenary debates on current energy initiatives, such as Renewable Energy Directive, carbon offset, and gas storage. Mr. Bușoi claims that his mission is to ensure that ITRE will be the main engine of change to achieve the decarbonization target and the transition to a green, circular economy without jeopardizing the Union's energy security or competitiveness, and very importantly, without eliminating jobs. So I will invite Mr. Bușoi to take the floor and give us a speech, the weighted speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lungu. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. It is an honor for me today to be here and to take this opportunity. I would like to take this opportunity to thank your president, Mr. Lungu, and also especially Mr. Doboshi, representing the Romanian Association, for inviting me. Indeed, I'll have to go back to the Parliament because we have a very difficult negotiation, discussion between different commissions, different committees in the European Parliament to establish who is responsible for the joint procurement in the defense sector. That's why at 10:30 I will have to leave this very interesting conference. But clearly, I would like to transmit a very clear message from European Parliament and from Industry, Research and Energy Committee that I'm chairing. From a climate perspective, the need to address the built environment is clear. Without tackling this area, we will not achieve climate neutrality in 2050 as defined by our laws. I just want to remind you that in its resolution in 2020 on the European Green Deal, the Parliament called in addition for a revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the issue that will be discussed this morning at your conference. The renovation wave also recognizes that buildings are responsible for about 40% of the EU's energy consumption and 36% of the GHG emissions from energy, but only around 1% of the building stock is renovated each year. So the rate is very low. The aim of this strategy was to at least double renovation rates in the next 10 years and make sure that renovations lead to higher energy and resource efficiency. Hence, the main objective of the recast of EPBD are to substantially reduce the emissions and finally energy consumption in the building sector by 2030 and to set a long-term vision for EU building sector that is climate neutral by 2050. So, yes, European Parliament was ready, and even if there are some divisions, and now we have some debates inside the Parliament and inside ITRE committee that are calling for the postponement of the whole file because of the economic crisis and the crisis of high energy prices. I would like to reassure you that in this moment, the ITRE committee is very much determined to finalize the negotiations, and we are supporting the rapporteur and shadows in this endeavor. There is a momentum to legislate to decrease dependency of Russian gas in line with the emergency measures on energy savings. With the war in Ukraine, Europe is in the midst of an energy crisis that is causing inflation to skyrocket. Even after the crisis will be over, gas prices will, for the near future, stay significantly higher than before 2022. At least these are the most of the forecasts, and this is what the industry is saying to us. With this new normal, there will be a need to help households not only during this winter, but also during the new normal for however long it lasts. This new baseline is projected to hit people in worse performing buildings, much times harder than people in an efficient building. That's why efficient buildings will really help citizens and industries to cope with this new reality. That's why we need to advance in our negotiations. As highlighted by the REPowerEU plan, energy efficiency is crucially important for addressing the energy and climate crisis. Every opportunity to save energy must be considered. The energy efficiency potential of technical building systems needs to be fully harvested by policies addressing individual products and by those focusing on the entire building. As it is also highlighted by the REPowerEU, we need to deploy renewables. The new renewable target, the cornerstones of an amended RED directive, the Renewable Energy Directive 4 and 5, under Rule 122, the last European Commission initiative. And this morning I opened the trilogue negotiations that is taking place just now between European Parliament and the Council with the participation of European Commission to finalize the debates on the Renewable Energy Directive modification. The process of replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy sources and other zero carbon solutions in the heating and cooling sector has so far been slower than in electricity generation, as renewables currently provide only 24% of that consumption. 50% of global energy consumption is wasted in the form of heat. I would like to focus on the heating system and installations a bit, as what we can apply to heat, we can invert to cooling systems as well. For the heat processes in building sector and the intake of renewables, at the moment we have some intake and status. First, bioenergy that leads in renewable heat consumption in buildings, used mainly in wood and pellet stoves and boilers, as well as in district heating networks, for which municipal waste and biomass comprise the majority of renewable supply. Then, of course, we have the renewable electricity as the second largest renewable energy commodity used for heat in buildings after bioenergy, and you know well, electric heaters, boilers, and heat pumps for buildings. Thirdly, we have heat pumps for ambient heat, which are also an increasingly important renewable heat source. Finally, of course, we could use the potential of solar and thermal, used essentially for domestic water heating and geothermal heat, of which almost 60% is harnessed by ground source heat pumps. The central role of heating and cooling in energy transition has been recognized under the European Green Deal's Climate Target Plan and Fit for 55 package, and is continuing to play an important role via the increased role of renewable energy shares in this large sector, without which the EU's energy and climate target, as I said at the beginning, cannot be achieved. We cannot achieve our strategic targets without really addressing and reforming, changing in this direction, the heating and the cooling sector. Last but not least, I would also like to reflect on an aspect that I find important, on the district heating and the district approach proposed in the Parliament. This approach reflects the local need and includes the core principle of system efficiency, which will allow each member state to apply cost-effective solutions in decarbonization of the building stock by enabling local and regional authorities to develop targeted strategies. This gives a broader view than just individual buildings. District approach should improve cost effectiveness, therefore should be based on the principles of technically, functionally, and economically feasibility. We need to understand that there is no solution that fits all. The district approach will allow member states the flexibility needed to advance the renovations and also the solutions that are proper for each situation, as we see many different situations in different member states, especially in Central and East Europe, but not only. Last but not least, renovation of our building stocks reduces both the energy footprint of buildings and the energy costs for households, while also boosting economic activity and job creation. So there is a strong commitment of European Parliament, of ITRE committee to advance with the Fit for 55, with the Green Deal agenda. Of course, we have REPowerEU that also bring significant input to these strategies and legislative files, as REPowerEU will not only allow us to phase out, to get rid of the Russian gas and Russian imports, but also with strong support for renewables, for energy efficiency, and also for hydrogen, will help us to reach easier our strategic targets, Fit for 55 and Green Deal, and will assure to European industries and European citizens decent prices and less volatility, and will not be dependent on the geopolitical weapons, as unfortunately we are experiencing now with the Russian gas. Thank you so much. A lot of success in your activity, and I'm in constant and permanent contact and collaboration with Mr. Lungu, with Mr. Doboshi. So all your work will be supported in the European Parliament. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Bușoi, for your speech, interesting speech. I have a short question for you. I said before that REHVA followed very closely the path of EPBD drafted project for the recast, and we would like to give more help to ITRE in order to take the most correct decisions. And my question is, how can we help ITRE more in depth, more closely? Because REHVA, in fact, gathers the knowledge for HVAC systems, not only HVAC, but also for energy efficiency, energy performance of buildings, for renewable resources. And that's why we have a lot of information to share with the political level.
Thank you so much. In ITRE committee, we always take very much into account the input from industry, from relevant stakeholders, as we are also the committee for industry. So much more than other committees, I don't want to criticize in ENVI committee, sometimes reluctant for the industry, but very committed on those goals that now we are sharing. in other committees, ITRE is really very sensitive to the input. So any input is welcomed. I know that until now, we received a lot of information and suggestions for amendments. What we should do now is, first of all, and Elisabetta will help us, my chief of staff will help us to assess the current situation, to look what is now, what are the main compromises and main lines that most probably will be the final outcome. Look a little bit together with this. The rapporteur is Mr. Kelly, no? Yes, it's Mr. Kelly, which is a colleague from European People's Party Center, right? So I can also, I try to be very concrete and practical. I can also moderate, and I can also facilitate contact and discussion with him. Look on what was already discussed and what are already the points of convergence, because we cannot go back to the initial phase. And looking there, what we could efficientize, what we could improve. And if it's something really hurting the industry, or it's not really applicable, too optimistic or less ambitious that we could achieve, clearly we could improve this via final discussions.
Okay, thank you so much for the reply. We all know that there are a lot of political decision in these directives, but also we would like to see many other technical aspects implemented. So thank you so much for your presentation. There is a question maybe in the room for, yes.
Well, Jarek Kurnitski, REHVA TRC. So how do you see, let's say, in the context of the EPBD, what's the role of the renewable energy? So do you see that renewable energy should be promoted, or the approach rather should be like it is in the EED, where we speak about the reduction of the total primary energy? And this is a kind of a question where we see that EPBD is quite flexible. So in the national implementation, you can go so that you will promote renewable energy if you want, or you can go so that all energies are equal, so including fossil gas or solar PV, and just to reduce the total energy use. But what's your position? Which way is should be preferred, and what could be the advice, let's say, how to then implement the EPBD if it is not too specific at the final wording?
Thank you so much. So clearly, the aim of Energy Efficiency Directive, and also in a way of EPBD, is to have more efficiency and less consumption, irrespective if we talk about classical energy, like fossil fuels that you mentioned, or even renewables. The idea is to consume less energy in a more efficient way, and we have to use those materials, construction materials and also renovation materials, in order that the consumption is less, and also the bills will be less. But clearly, when you talk about the source, because we didn't invent until now something that consumes zero energy. The reduction could be achieved, but still a lot of energy will be consumed by our buildings in our heating and cooling systems in the future also. Of course, the renewables are preferred, as this will help us to reach our climate goals that we really need to reach. And as I said, the negotiation this morning on what we call RED 3, Renewable Energy Directive revision, not the permitting part that we call RED 4 or even RED 5, then last week a decision of European Commission. Today, one of the discussions, and maybe they will finalize successful the negotiation, and we'll have a final text in red, will refer to the heating and cooling part and the buildings part. So these three, RED, Energy Efficiency Directive, and of course EPBD, which is specific for the buildings, will have first to align a little bit, not to contradict in between. each will look from a different angle, but clearly we need first to reduce consumption, and then from the consumption that is already reduced, renewable sources should be supported, promoted, even incentivized financially at the beginning before becoming a strong business case.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If at 10:45 I will not be in the office of Mr. Lange, SEDE committee will take a lot of prerogatives on the, I'm joking, but I have to be there to negotiate for the procurement in the defense sector.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much
for your presence. And we will keep close to your activities. And of course, we will get back to your chief of staff to maybe schedule a meeting. Yes.
Thank you so much. A lot
Thank
of
you.
success.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. So the next presentation will be about zero emission buildings in the EPBD review. Our distinguished speaker is Paula Rey-Garcia, Miss Paula Rey-Garcia, Deputy Head of Unit B3 from DGNR. Unit B stands for Just Transition, Consumers, Energy Efficiency and Innovation. She is an important contributor in the buildings and the products sector on topics such as the energy efficient building systems and the better enforcement of efficiency assessment. So Ms. Garcia, please take the floor for your presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and good morning to everybody. It's very nice to also meet in person again, because I think latest meeting that I had participated in was still in only virtual format. So indeed, now after Mr. Bușoi introduction, we move into much more detailed issues now with the focus on buildings. And in addition, when we look at heating and cooling, of course, what is also very important is what we are doing on the product side, which is fully complementary to the efforts that we are making through the EPBD. And my colleague from my unit, Philippe Rivière, I understand will be also here in the afternoon to look into some of these issues in much more detail. So, yeah. So how does it fit the revision of the energy performance of buildings directive into what Mr. Bușoi was explaining? You know, the climate ambition, the new increased target that we have of 55%. And then, of course, the different strategies that were setting, let's say, the overall mandate for this commission, such as the European Green Deal or the renovation wave. So in this regard, it's important to mention that really buildings are fully central to these efforts. So already in the climate target plan that was translating, let's say, the objective of 55% into detailed analysis to underpin the different revisions that are part of the so-called Fit for 55 package, which includes, as Mr. Bușoi was mentioning, the Energy Efficiency Directive, the Renewable Directive, but also all the revision of the climate legislation that is ongoing. There it was made very clear that buildings really need to be central to this transformation. So the emissions specifically of buildings should be reduced by 60% by 2030, which is something quite significant. Also, their final energy consumption needs to be diminished. And what is also quite important, the consumption for heating and cooling is also requiring some important reduction. And now, of course, with the context of the war in Ukraine, all this becomes even more acute, let's say, because of our dependence, in particular in the heating and cooling sector. In addition, of course, if we look at the building sector, a big majority of the efforts need to come from the existing stock, and that's where the renovation wave fits in, really trying to improve the 1% very low rate that was mentioned right before, and bringing it up quite significantly, and also moving those renovations towards deeper renovations, because that's really the only way we could then deliver on the different targets that we have. So from this framework, what we have then as concrete objectives of the revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive are, on the one hand, to really contribute very significantly to these greenhouse gas emission reduction objectives for the building sector as the main really legal instrument touching the building sector, but then also to give a longer term vision towards 2050. So it was analyzed, and also it was a very clear contribution from stakeholders that the vision that existed in the current directive was, from this perspective, outdated. It was not really having in mind this 2050 objective, and therefore it required also an important revision from that point of view. And this, of course, touches on new buildings, which is something that I will also look at in more detail. So zooming into a bit more detail, then within the revision, in the end, what we have this time around, as opposed to the revision that was part of the clean energy package, is a very fundamental revision of the directive, a very broad one. So in 2018, well, 16-18, with the clean energy package, the main aim was to make sure that the key modernization aspects were introduced, that a strengthened focus on renovation was included, but at the same time there was an effort made to make the revision quite targeted so that implementation would continue in parallel. And this was very important, in particular for the 2020 targets that were included in the directive for nearly zero energy buildings, the progress on energy performance certificates. So we didn't want to put all that on hold, and therefore it was chosen to do a targeted revision. This time around is a very fundamental one. It touches really on all aspects. It's quite a transformation as regards renovation, with the introduction of minimum energy performance standards. It also goes very far as regards the decarbonization of buildings for the reasons that I have explained. It looks very much into the technical building systems, heating, cooling, ventilation, but also into everything that has to do with digitalization, including of everything related to energy performance certificates, infrastructure for sustainable mobility, and finally, but also very important, of course, the link to finance. This is really fundamental, in particular for existing buildings. So this is some of the analysis that we have been doing now in support of the repower work, everything that has to do with the efforts of the Commission with the different emergency measures to really achieve demand reduction, not only diversification of supply, but also demand reduction. And really the aim with this slide is to show that there is really a lot of potential to tap. So really, if we compare the, let's say, the lowest classes, the so-called worst performing buildings, which are a focus of this revision, with, let's say, the top ones, the difference is quite huge. And this, of course, shows in the energy bill. So it's something very relevant to tackle. But then the question is how to do it in practice, and how to also give a very clear signal to the financial sector so that also financing flows into buildings, the renovation, considering that it's also a very granular sector. So it's often, let's say, less attractive from the financial point of view, because it requires quite a lot of effort, of aggregation, of technical assistance, and therefore the signal from the legislative side needs to be then very, very clear, so to make it work. So then moving into really what I was mentioning as the vision for 2050, the role of new buildings. What we have now introduced in the directive is a new, let's say, vision for these buildings, which is the zero emission building, which really, as in the Commission proposal, had a number of benchmarks of what those buildings would consume and what renewable energy they would have embedded, let's say. They have an incentive not only for on-site renewables, which was already the case and is already the case in the current directive, but also for local solutions, as were mentioned in the first presentation, efficient district heating and energy communities, and on these aspects really making a cross reference to the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Renewables Directive, because all these pieces of legislation look into these issues from complementary perspectives and therefore need to be very coherent. It also looks, of course, at the existing stock. So it connects to existing buildings by making this vision for zero emission buildings also, let's say, the end point of a deep renovation over time. And it also looks into some reinforcement of indoor air quality aspects. Currently, the directive only looks at the operation phase of buildings, and now with the revision, there are some initial steps taken towards the consideration of life cycle global warming potential. So really looking at the whole cycle. And then in this regard, what we are doing is to rely very much on the standards that are already there and on the work led by our colleagues in DG Environment in particular, on the levels framework, which has been looking into these issues very closely with industry over already some years. Right now is a calculation, so it's, let's say, an element of information without requirements attached, and focusing on those buildings where it would be, let's say, more feasible to introduce it. So really concentrating in particular on new buildings. And then as part of this vision for zero emission buildings, of course, also everything that has to do with strengthening of e-mobility, sustainable mobility aspects, which were already introduced in the previous amendment, in the 2018 amendment, part of the clean energy package. But now, of course, they need to also be aligned with the increased ambition, which is much higher than the one that we had at the time. So as was saying, regarding whole life cycle carbon, then it's really first steps addressing those, but also linking them to national building renovation plans, so that gradually this becomes part of the planning of member states, and informs really the market. I mean, there are some member states that are already quite advanced in this area, but they are so far rather the exception. So we'll see what comes out of the negotiation, because this is one of the aspects that, for instance, Parliament is quite keen on reinforcing, and a number of member states as well. Being an information element, so what is mandatory, as I said, is the calculation, but not, let's say, meeting a certain level. But then, of course, it needs to be linked back into the energy performance certificate, so that in the label for the building, we have this information. It was also mentioned, of course, the impetus that we have with REPowerEU, with a strong support for renewables, for heat pumps, for solar, for energy efficiency. And this has resulted in parallel to the negotiation, but now is fully embedded into the revised EPBD as it is being discussed by Council and Parliament. Is an amendment on solar energy in buildings, a specific one, which has become the new Article 9A of the directive as negotiated, let's say. And here as well, for new buildings is also more ambitious. And it concerns not only, let's say, installations on new buildings, but also a much more thorough consideration at the design phase, so that when a building is being designed, that really the potential for solar energy is maximized, and this is taken into consideration at that point as well. Of course, we also need to look at the feasibility. So for this reason, also the article includes the provision for member states to look into these aspects in more detail and to really set the detailed rules for implementing this article and possible exceptions. But still, this is really, as it was mentioned in the introduction, really important if we are to deliver also on the REPower objectives and to reduce, of course, dependency from imports of fossil fuels. So really, then to conclude, I mean, these are just elements of what is there now in negotiation. Is really very important in our view that not only a final agreed EPBD gives a very, very strong signal on the renovation of existing buildings, but also that the definition, the final definition and the final obligations on new buildings are strong enough, because this will be what will drive also, we believe, the sector forward. So it will set really the new model. It will also have a strong link to renovation by becoming also the, let's say, end goal over time. So although new buildings are not the main part of the stock, let's say, or of the efforts that we need to undertake according to the climate target plan, still it will have a huge influence on how the transformation of the sector develops over time. So from this perspective and connecting back to what is happening now, so for those of you who follow this more closely, so the Commission made the proposal in December 2021. It has been discussed now in a first phase by Council, and during the current Czech presidency, there was the agreement now on the 25th of October of what is the Council position. That preserves quite some parts of the original Commission proposal, but also weakens some others. And what is now happening now is that the file is now much more now in the Parliament hands for the definition of the Parliament position. As it was mentioned, there was a push, let's say, to postpone the directive, which from the Commission side, we really would raise question marks about, because this is really a directive that is quite central to the efforts that we have now in the context of the energy crisis and of the war in Ukraine. And what we see, nevertheless, is a slight, let's say, delay in the Parliament calendar, because they need more time to build their position. So in principle, we could have then, let's say, the conclusion of the Parliament position beginning of next year, and then the final, let's say, trilogues that were mentioned, bringing together also Council and Parliament for a final deal, let's say, in the second quarter of next year. So this is in terms of calendar, which I think is also quite important for you and for your members. So it's really towards the Parliament now that is quite important that you make your inputs in regards of this directive. So this was it from my side, but of course happy to get questions now or later if more practical. Thank you.
Maybe later. Thank you for the interesting presentation you gave to our attendees here on site and also online. The next speaker, so we will have that Q&A session at the end of our session, morning session. So the next presentation is about indoor environment and quality and primary energy aspects in zero emission buildings and deep renovation. Jarek Kurnitski, our known colleague from REHVA, from TRC committee of our federation. I need to present you, Jarek, even if you are very known the person and the expert. So Jarek Kurnitski is the chair of REHVA Technology and Research Committee, a professor at Taltech University of Technology and Aalto University, and director of the Department of Civil Engineering and Architecture at Taltech. Mr. Kurnitski is known as an important contributor in the preparation of technical definitions for nearly zero energy buildings. Other activities include the work in the field of energy efficiency of the built environment in Estonia and Finland, and preparation of the European Residential Ventilation Guidebook as part of a task force. So, Jarek, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for this comprehensive introduction. And in my presentation, I will try to take a step further to be a bit more technical. So what EPBD means in terms of IAQ and primary energy requirements, and especially what's the situation when you take this on the national level and then start to decide which requirements should be established to be in line with the directive. And indeed, the history is here already quite long. So this is the third revision, and this directive really has developed, and it's comprehensive and also technically complex document. And finally, it is a question how harmonized implementation we can expect on the member states. So if everybody will implement it in its own way, maybe then it's not serving fully the purpose. So it is also important to point out that the energy use in buildings, it's mainly to provide good indoor environmental quality, and as this quality level very remarkably will affect energy use. So when it is highly important to have a specification for the IAQ when we speak about energy performance requirements. And really we can find from the EPBD, for instance, when you make a shirts, you can find healthy indoor environment, healthy indoor climate, comfort, indoor air quality, ventilation. So these are addressed in many places. But it's also quite clear that these explicit requirements regarding the IAQ, these are left on the responsibility of the member states. So primary energy has been the main indicator in the directive, and it is indeed very important for the member states to understand the calculation principles, and for instance when non-renewable or total primary energy factors should be used and how to be used. I will start with IAQ. Now it includes one small but very significant new requirement to equip non-residential zero emission buildings with measuring and control devices for the regulation of indoor air quality. And this will also apply for major renovation if technically and economically feasible. And very likely it will be when we speak about major renovation, which typically means deep renovation projects where all the HVAC systems or most of them will be anyhow replaced. So this perhaps can be understood as something we know as a demand controlled ventilation, controlled based on the CO2 and temperature. And very likely we can expect that manufacturers will make this number much bigger in the future because currently it's too small. But the importance is increasing. We want to know what's in addition to the room temperature. We want to know what is the CO2 concentration in any, let's say, commonly used spaces in non-residential buildings, and this is something what we can expect in the future, and that would be indeed a nice progress. When it is also stressed in the inspection that standalone ventilation systems should also undergo to the inspection, And inspection scheme requirement includes that the sizing of the ventilation system should be compared with the requirements of the building. Here, once again, there is a reference to the requirements. And yes, these requirements are to specified on national basis because they are not specified in the directive. So it was already in the previous version of the directive that negative effects such as inadequate ventilation should be avoided. So there is no change. This is indeed continuously very important. But now indoor environmental quality is stressed both for the new buildings and major renovations. And it is clearly stated that the issues of the healthy indoor climate conditions shall be addressed in Articles 7 and 8. So this, I would say, also could be interpreted so that the national regulation should be placed for the IAQ and minimum ventilation rates. And why the ventilation is so important? Because the main issue in the directive, as Paula told to us, is this renovation. To boost the deep renovation, to transform the building stock to zero emission by 2050. And if ventilation will fail in the renovation, then indeed consequences can be very serious. So we very well know that additional insulation and replacement of windows will block the air change if ventilation system will not be installed as a part of the renovation. And then you can end up with mold problems and any other IAQ problems. And that's a serious business to be addressed in the implementation of EPBD nationally. And it is very likely that this is also worth to follow how these Article 7 and 8 requirements will be implemented in practice in the member states to be sure that this implementation would be successful. Then I will go to these primary energy requirements. So these apply for the minimum energy performance requirements and also basically for the energy performance certificate scale. And the proposal from 21 of October included some important, let's say, additions. And here we speak about which primary energy to be used, because there is quite unspecific expression of the primary energy, and it's not clarified always, not always, but in some places it's clarified, should it account the total or just the non-renewable primary energy. And this is also important for the energy performance scale. So basically, in this procedure, when you take this nationally, I can list 5 steps every member states will need to do to issue all the national requirements required to implement this directive. So first step is to define the assessment boundary. And there are good definitions in the directive saying that assessment boundary is the boundary where delivered and exported energy are measured or calculated. So this assessment boundary definition can depend what's the practice to install energy meters nationally. And there are a couple of practices indeed in Europe, not only the single one. And when delivered energy is clearly defined as energy supplied through the assessment boundary. So this is quite important, and now I have a couple of perhaps complicated technical slides, but this is needed to understand what are the bases in the directive for the primary energy calculation. So this would be one possibility to set assessment boundary. And these energy meters locations are showed with this smart meter here. We also need to distinguish not only to have a grid electricity, but to distinguish nearby electricity and community electricity. And those metering depends on the technical and contractual arrangements. So this metering is not shown in this figure. But basically, if we speak about smart meters when they are two-way meters and can measure both delivered grid electricity and exported grid electricity, and same for the district heat, district cooling. So these exported energy flows are shown with dashed lines because they directly do not have any impact on the energy performance of a building, and typically are not accounted to these primary energy values, but indeed physically they do exist, but the surplus energy flows will be exported to the grid at least. So when with calculating total and non-renewable primary energy, it is said in the definitions quite clearly that primary energy is calculated from the delivered energy, and to calculate non-renewable primary energy is very straightforward. But when we will go to the total primary energy, there are a couple of options. First, to include or not to include ambient heat. And in Article 16, it is basically said that the ambient heat should be excluded, but is not in line with existing overarching standard, but this is clearly fixed in the directive. And then how to calculate on-site photovoltaic or on-site renewable energy production, would that be accounted inside the total primary energy or not? So that would be depend how the assessment boundary will be specified. If that would be so, like it was in the last slide, in this case, on-site renewable energy is not delivered energy because it's not supplied through the assessment boundary, it's inside the assessment boundary, and would not be calculated to total primary energy. So sounds complicated, but this is very important, and especially there is also good hint in the ZEP requirement where total primary energy needs to be covered by on-site nearby renewable or community generated renewable energy, also by effective district heating and cooling, and then finally from carbon-free electricity from the grid. And here also in this requirement, this logic supports that don't put photovoltaic on the both sides of the equations, because in such a case it does not help to cover this total primary energy, referring that the total primary energy is intended to be calculated from the delivered energy, so energy delivered to the building site. And if not so, then it would be very difficult to actually to fulfill this requirement. So when there are also some, let's say, step 2 cost optimal national calculations are needed to set the requirements, and there is some guidance in the Annex 1 what needs to be taken into account when we speak about the numeric indicator of primary energy use. And Annex 1 also requires to recognize benefits from the district heating, cooling, and also positive influence from the renewable energy generation. I will show one example. It is published in the REHVA journal, and I'm not going to the details, but basically this can be taken in a cold climate, in the Nordic climate zone, as a cost optimal data, or can be at least close to the cost optimal data. And the calculation is conducted with 3 heat sources. It's with district heat, effective district heat, actually, air to water heat pump, and gas boiler. And then compare them how the requirements based on these calculations could be nationally set. So what is important to understand is the summary in this slide. For instance, to the air to water heat pump, we can see that the energy use of this all electric building will be covered partly by the solar photovoltaic, and the rest is from the grid. And we also export something to the grid, but we don't account this exported energy. And here the calculation of non-renewable primary energy and total primary energy will just go with different factors, default factors from the overarching standard I used in this example. So we get non-renewable and total primary energy values for all cases. And in the case of district heat or gas boiler, when indeed this there is another delivered energy, what is either the district heat or gas, and it is good to notice that it's quite interesting that district heat provides the highest total primary energy value, close to 89, and at the same time the smallest non-renewable primary energy value compared to all of these cases. So it very much will depend which calculation way with which primary energy factors would be selected to set these cost optimal requirements. And if we would use a total primary energy to set national requirements, then to enable the use of effective district heat, we need to take this highest possible value. So it cannot be smaller than 89, and then the gas boiler and air to water heat pump will very easily comply with this requirement. But when making so, being based on the total primary energy, when we did not actually follow the requirements what are in the Annex 1 to take into account the positive effect of renewable energy. And for that purpose, additional numeric indicator must be set, and in this case, a non-renewable primary energy, when the value 63 can be used to make possible to use both air to water heat pump and district heat and block the gas heating. And in the conclusion, we see that if we will go with a total primary energy, then this will enable to use of all of these free heat generation systems, including the gas boiler. But if we will go with non-renewable, then only air to water heat pump and district heat can be used. So it can be actually concluded that this total primary energy would be redundant in this case, and it is enough to use only one indicator with non-renewable primary energy indicator. And we have also this requirement that total primary energy needs to be covered. So in the case of air to water heat pump, photovoltaic was not enough to cover this, and especially because the default primary energy factor for the grid electricity was so high. So with calculating with this 2.5 ends up to very high value. So the requirement is not satisfied, but for the effective district heat case, it is satisfied. Then we also tried to do the calculation with 2030 EU electricity BEF values, which are 1.6, and then also slightly increasing the photovoltaic when it was possible to satisfy this requirement also for air to water heat pumps. So it is basically possible to fulfill also this requirement in the future when the electricity generation will develop as expected. And finally, the last step, also energy performance certificate classes have to be defined, and one purpose of the EPBD is to harmonize these EPC scales. And when it is quite clearly said that the total primary energy needs to be used, so we end up with a situation where non-renewable primary energy can be applied for the minimum requirements, but for the EPC classes, directive says that these should be based on the total PEF in the current version. So to conclude, IAQ is addressed, but explicit requirements are on the responsibility of the member states, and very likely this new requirement for zero emission buildings can really make an improvement in the construction. And it would be nationally quite difficult to be in line if IAQ requirements and ventilation requirements do not exist. So hopefully EPBD will provide a clear message to have these requirements available at national level. And when these energy analysis showed that non-renewable primary energy indicator can be used for the requirements, but for the EPC scale, total primary energy has been used. And there are quite many factors what are needed to issue these national requirements. So we need non-renewable primary energy factors. That has been actually the current practice in most of the member states. Then we need to have a biomass factor. That also has been a current practice, because this cannot be calculated with a non-renewable factor. And then we need to have a total PEF for EPC classes, which are currently not present, at least in the most of the member states, when this carbon-free electricity factor is new, so that the nuclear can be also accounted to this in addition to renewable energy. And finally, CO2 emission factors to calculate the operational CO2, but these have been also in use already in many countries. Finally, there is also a small escape route in the directive. So in the Annex 1, it is specified that alternatively to the primary energy factors, it's possible to use the weighting factors for the numeric indicator of the primary energy. So, and this could provide indeed more flexibility on the national basis if this set long list of all factors needed seems to be a bit overkill, and indeed it's important that the engineers will understand how the calculation will go and the correct factor will be applied in correct place, and the same for national regulators to understand and to not to make the system too overcomplicated. But it's quite complicated question. So thank you. That was my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Jarek, for your 20 minutes short course. It was very clear. Maybe now we will need the seminar scheduled with you to explain more in depth what was said and written in your presentation. Anyhow, I say that breakthrough ideas need some time to be implemented. Maybe we will have a chance to discuss with ITRE and do something, but I'm afraid that maybe it's too late, but let's see what discussion will be. Thank you again. We switch to the next speaker, who is Mr. Benjamin Haas, Director of Regulatory Affairs at ENGIE. Mr. Haas has important contributions as a project manager for scientific research and development at Lab Crygen in the field of the regulation of energy and environmental performance of the buildings. So, Mr. Haas, please take the floor.
Thank you, everyone. And if can switch on the slides. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm glad to speak about the regulation, the French regulation for the energy performance of building in France, which includes some life cycle analysis. Will I have the slides on the?
I think in a few moments.
Okay.
Marie is working on that. So,
okay, so
you have to keep the attention of the
no problem.
In the meanwhile,
no problem with that. So I will be talking about the French regulation. However, I'm not representing the French administration. I'm representing ENGIE, and I have a slide of introduction about the company, but I'm quite sure that many of you knows this company, especially in Belgium. But the reason why I will be talking to you about that is also that I've been involved now. It's been more than 10 years, almost 15 years in my previous missions in the fields of the regulation of building energy performance. So before ENGIE, I was at the CSTB, the Scientific Center, which works with the public administration for setting up the regulation. And when I started at ENGIE at the research center, I also worked on the subject and with quite some of you. So I have this double point of view somehow. So I have the point of view of the guy who worked with the public administration, and also the point of view of my company that also, of course, I'm representing here. Do you want me to switch on my laptop because the slides are? Oh, okay. Up. And it shouldn't be up. Coming in. It always needs a bit of time to switch on, but generally it works at the end. Here it should be shared. I have the red light on the dongle, but nothing on the screen. No. Sorry for the delay. It's in the REHVA mail, right? Almost there. Yes. Full screen. There. Okay, perfect. Sorry for the delay. Let's go on. So very quick introduction on the company. I think it's important that you know what I represent here. That ENGIE is energy utility focusing on 30 countries. It's been wider than that before. We're focusing these days with 4 major core activity with the goal of achieving zero carbon by 2045. And I think it's important because we worked on that 5 years already before the ultimate goal of 2050. With this 4 core activity, renewable production, with respect to these 3 energy vectors, green gas included, hydrogen, biogas, electricity, with some figures that you can read, and we will not repeat what on the screen, and also heat. Namely, here is district heating. So on these 3 vectors, we aim at quite significant increase, at least significant For ENGIE, we have a lot of activity in the field of infrastructure, gas, electricity, and district heating. We are a major player in energy efficiency solutions for residential and non-residential sector, and also in thermal electricity production. I won't go into the detail, it's not our topic here. And also energy supplies to B2B and B2C sector. This is to set the picture a little bit. Okay, reaching zero carbon in buildings. It's the roadmap from the point of view of ENGIE is the first 3 bullet point. Do I have a pointer here? Or no pointer? I will use that. Sorry, I thought it was off. Previous slide. Okay. So to decarbonize, I will be focusing on new buildings. Important point, because the topic is life cycle analysis, and in France we have implementation of life cycle analysis in the regulation for new building only, and I have an opening for existing buildings. So all these slides will be focusing on new buildings. So the roadmap, as we see it at ENGIE for decarbonizing the new building, it's in 3 steps, but it was something you're familiar with: energy demand reduction, energy efficiency, then first principle, and third step, using renewable energy. And if I focus on the French regulation for new building, which is enforced since early 2022, with some disclaimers at the bottom of the slide, because to date, not all sectors that are covered, but they will be covered. It works very schematically in 3 steps. So we have a first step of limiting the heating lighting needs. We have a second step, limiting total and non-renewable energy production. So I think it's an interesting point given the previous discussion that we had, and also with the representative of the Commission. And the third step, which is limiting carbon emission evaluated in life cycle analysis. So I want to focus on these 2 points. I won't go into the details of the limitation of heating and lighting needs. And so the limitation in the energy use is done in primary energy in agreement with the EPBD. So we have the first hurdle, which is the total primary consumption, which encompasses all energy that can be metered. So I wrote invoiced, but I think it's more or less the same thing, meaning that, for example, on-site solar is considered as free. And why this first step is considered as important, and why don't we only focus on non-renewable energy? I would say 2 things. First thing is that renewable energy is not to be wasted. But of course, if you use only total primary energy, you end up with some issues that have been presented in the previous presentation. But using total primary energy has a big advantage. Also, it allows to avoid that the energy efficiency of the building is being decreased thanks to the use of renewable. And having these 2 steps articulated allows to put inside the building only efficient system. So for example, if you don't use total primary energy, and if you use primary energy factor, for example, for 0.2 for nuclear, in France, you will have direct electric heaters everywhere, which was more or less what was done in the 80s and the 90s, and it's catastrophic. Won't go into the detail of what, but this is typically what happens. So this is why these 2 steps are very interesting. And in France, so they relies on primary energy factor, of course. Some of you are aware of this European standard that we've been working on with some colleagues in the room that's set up a comparison framework for the calculation of primary energy factor. For electricity, the factor that is used in France is a prospective factor, prospective up to 2035 of 2.3. So what is interesting to remark here is that the current factor is 2.9, and historical primary energy factor for other energy vectors. So interesting to note here that you don't have a level playing field. So here, an interesting question that I ask myself, and also I think it's important when it comes to comparing what is a class A and a class A and F class in the various EPCs. How do you compare the regulation between one another? And especially, how do you compare the French regulation with the European regulation? If you take an F class with a given figure, given the fact that it depends on primary energy factor that, as you can see, are not necessarily consistent with one another, not mentioning that the rules of calculation behind them may be different, may differ between countries, but also climate is very specific. The computing kernel is very specific. French computing kernel is different from others, etc., and etc. So it's difficult to compare. So it's important when it comes to compare all these F class, A class, to have in mind that the underlying hypotheses are very different between countries. So as I said, not representing the French administrator, and it's interesting also to have our point of view, but you already got it, I think. That ENGIE is in favor of a level playing field, that the hypotheses behind all these primary energy factors are consistent for all energy vector, and also strongly in favor of energy first principle, so using efficient system, and the total primary energy consumption is a hurdle which is useful in order to be sure that only efficient system will be installed in the building. Second step, carbon emission in life cycle analysis. So this was the third step in my three hurdles that I showed in the first slide. So what about the emission of the materials sector? So according to the IEA, you can find the figures in their reports, the building industry, I mean, constructing the building themselves, represents around 30% of the carbon emission of buildings, so 70% being the energy use on a yearly basis. So this is the situation, and this is why this figure is very important. If it comes to new building only, so it would be slightly different calculation, but it would represent between 50% for a fossil gas fuel building to 80% of the carbon intensity in life cycle of the building. So definitely for new building, if you don't go to life cycle analysis, you miss the elephant in the room. And what I would add also beyond these slides is that this elephant is crucial because these are emissions that are emitted when the building is delivered, not over 50 years. So you don't have the room to reduce the carbon footprint of your energy vector in 10, in 20, in 40, in 50 years. This 50% for gas fossil fuel doesn't happen in 50 years. They happen in 2 years. So this is why it's absolutely key to tackle. So in the French regulation, so once again, for new building, we address the carbon impact in this life cycle approach, and we consider the carbon emission for construction, operation, energy use, slightly the same thing, but they are differentiated, and decommissioning of the building with 2 thresholds. So we have a threshold with a limitation on the carbon emission due to energy use, so heating, cooling, lighting, ventilation, you're familiar with this, and a limitation on the carbon emission due to construction, operation, and decommissioning of the building, taking into account that some systems have to be changed over the 50 years of the period of assessment that is used in France. Important things to note is that in France, and it's a debate right now, this is why I wanted to highlight this, all this is without considering market-based tool. So everything related to green certificates is out. It's only for the experts. It's a location-based approach. It's not a market-based approach. And therefore, if in creating your cement or in your energy use, you want to show the advantage of financing the renewable energy production, you can't at this stage. PPA is a bit different. Which may be an issue, and I know that it's quite a complicated issue. And once again, we will not be going into detail of that. But the industrials and buildings that will want to promote to help the production of new energy renewable facilities, they won't be able, if it's through green certificates, to show that in their final carbon balance. Conclusion and openings here. So the French, did I wondering if I missed something? No, maybe not. So the French, so RE 2020, regulation energy, the R and the E are for regulation energy, the other way around. So goes beyond the current EPBD in that respect, maybe not the next EPBD, with an LCA analysis for CO2 emission, which I think is a very efficient tool. I did not go into the details of how it works in practice. Yeah, afterward, we can discuss about that, but I didn't want to go into technical details. LCA is also a mindset for me, because the interesting thing behind it is that it requires a holistic reasoning. For example, there are discussions these days on banning fossil fuel boilers. However, if you work in LCA, you also realize that behind your electricity, you have a gas plant, or you have also fossil fuel plants in general. And banning a direct use of fossil fuel would require consistently to ban the indirect use of fossil fuel, which is a bit more difficult to do. We have ideas, because in any case, we have to go to zero in the use of fossil fuels, direct or indirect. And thus, for us, the energy first principle remained the main pillar in order not to transfer any significant impact beyond the scope of analysis. And this is where LCA help. Primary energy factor also, by the way. An opening about existing building. For new building, it's rather simple if you have the databases, if you have the computing tool to do LCA, because you have all the materials that are used. This is something which is rather simple to get, and if you have the databases in order to link these materials to this environmental impact, the job is done. And we have the database in France in order to do that. It's independent from levels, but it's something that works. However, if you go to residential building, there it becomes more complicated, because the impact of removing materials, for example, all this is very, very difficult to evaluate, and maybe a more operational position will be not to push to LCA, but to push towards circular economy and reuse of materials that are extracted from the building. So definitely a different approach, but at some point it has to be tractable, and this may be for renovation a more tractable approach than LCA that will be very, very, very difficult, and especially for all the very small scale renovation, single family houses, and etc. Okay, I'm through with my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Benjamin, for the presentation. I will invite you to take your place and wait for the Q&A session. The last speaker of this morning session is Ms. Haas with another interesting subject. Again, zero emission building, but linked to some other preoccupation, meaning the green building certification schemes. Ms. Ursula Hartenberger is the Secretary General of CPEA, Climate Positive European Alliance. She has extensive expertise in applying sustainable development principles in real estate and construction, with an extensive network at EU, UN, and industry level. She is former member of the Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, responsible for drafting technical screening criteria for building sectors. So the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you for the kind invitation to speak at this REHVA event. Just a few words about the climate. Whoops. Obviously, that was not correct. Yeah, about the climate positive Europe Alliance, and the stress is very much on climate positive. We are a small non-for-profit association based here in Brussels, and you can see at the bottom the founding member logo. So it's basically 4 green building councils from across Europe, and we're very pleased that REHVA is also one of our founding members, and therefore I feel especially honored to be able to speak here today. So our core mission really is to transform markets, the construction and real estate markets, towards more sustainable market practices, and the stress here very much is on market, because we really much work with a bottom-up approach. We want to be sort of an interface. We're an interface between industry and policy, and we want to bring policy, explain policy to the market, to our members, and also bring the market expertise and insights on policy developments back to policy makers. Today, I'm going to talk about how certification systems are engaging with the zero emissions target and the Commission's climate target plan. And given that these 4 green building councils from Denmark, from Germany, from Spain, and from Austria all work with the DGNB system, I've taken the liberty on focusing on the DGNB system. Of course, fully cognizant that there are a number of other certification schemes in operation also in European markets. So just a few words about the DGNB certification for those of you who are not familiar with that. Basically, DGNB stands for Deutsche Gesellschaft für nachhaltiges Bauen, which means German Sustainable Building Country in a free kind of translation. The DGNB was founded in 2007. It's based in Stuttgart in Germany, and it has about 1,600 members. But it does not just certify in Germany alone, but also in around 35 countries. How does that work? It basically means that depending on the requirements, the local requirements, whenever certificates are awarded outside of Germany, the DGNB adapts a certification system to local requirements. The DGNB works very closely with local institutions. It has a DGNB academy and has now trained experts in sustainable building in roughly 40 countries worldwide. And also in terms of imparting knowledge, it's involved in university partnerships in 10 countries, and we regularly partner also in research projects. So before I go into the initiatives that the DGNB is currently involved in or initiating in terms of zero emission buildings, just a very quick reminder of what we're up against. These are figures for Germany, but I guess that they would be very much representative for other countries in Europe as well. So 35% of national CO2 emissions in Germany come from energy consumption in buildings, and 7% of national CO2 emissions resulting from materials and equipment, site and end of life. And the figures that you can see here, they're very much inclusive. So we're not just looking in terms of the manufacture of building materials. We're not just looking at the figures nationally, but also, at where these CO2 emissions come from elsewhere. So in other countries, if the production is elsewhere. And there we have the focus on the operation of the buildings. So basically, this very much sets the scene from what for what I will now be talking about in terms of initiatives to address these rather staggering figures. So First, I'd like to introduce you to the Klima Plus package for DGNB certification. It has been developed to increase the ambition for ongoing projects by motivating project developers through a number of numerous bonuses that are related to the DGNB system. So basically, it focuses on climate neutral operation, increasing the share of renewable energy sources, motivating and promoting for the creation of climate protection roadmaps, increase the energy production on site, and also an analysis of climate risk. So this applies to the current DGNB system for new buildings, for renovation, buildings in use, and also district certification. So, and in addition to the Klima Plus initiative, the DGNB also developed a framework for carbon neutral buildings and sites. So there are two core elements designed to create more clarity and transparency for market participants. A, the definition of carbon neutrality. What does that actually mean? And then also it provides effective, explains what does it actually mean to have an effective approach and an effective strategy for greenhouse gas emissions. And I will now go into a little bit more detail. It consists of 4 core parts. Yeah, this, the climate action strategy. So we have here part 1 covers the CO2 accounting. Part 2 covers the development of climate action roadmaps for individual buildings. Then the reporting via a climate pass, and then also verification processes. So let me start with part 1, which is obviously logical. So that's the accounting. So for the accounting, the DGNB developed a core definition. And the definition elements you can see here on the slides. So there is the zero CO2 emissions goal, and is balanced at 0 or less than 0 greenhouse emission for all types of building. Then the total energy balance takes the total energy balance as a basis. So building energy and user energy must be considered together, so you don't split that up. And then it looks at the actual CO2 intensity. All energy sources are considered with the CO2 emissions generated. And if CO2 emissions are actually avoided, so any excess energy generated at the property enters accounting as a credit. Yeah, CO2 certificates from elsewhere cannot be counted. So that's the accounting part of the framework. Now, this is just sort of a practical example how this works in construction. So basically, you have here the site, but the whole accounting takes also into account the product stage and the end of life stage. And the same goes for, applies here, a practical example for operation. Looks also at indirect emissions, direct emissions, and again, the credits that I already mentioned for operation. Moving on to part 2, this is it's a core element of the framework. That is the development of the climate action roadmap. Because the DGNB very much feels that climate action and associated investments must be planned in a focused manner. Because only if you define clear objectives for buildings and sustain these objectives and implement associated measures in a future-oriented manner, can you actually optimally combine climate action and economic viability of the investment. So I've already said that this climate action roadmap has to be done for each individual building. So you cannot take a cluster of buildings and do that. You have to really take the effort to do this for each building individually. So the creation of this climate action roadmap consists of the different steps. So first, step 1 would be determining the initial condition. Step 2, you look at potential analysis for relevant focus area where you want to focus on your climate roadmap. Then you do the cost assessment of the measures, then the time planning of the measures and determining targets for that building. Step 5 is the documentation and quality assurance of the creation of the climate roadmap. And step 6 would be determining responsibilities and planning the first implementation steps for that building. And very closely linked to that, obviously, part 3 is then the CO2 reporting by means of a climate action passport. And this, the passport would then contain the following information: a short description of the building, the total balance of greenhouse gas emissions. Then it would describe the relative key metrics using a suitable reference value, such as CO2 emissions per user, per unit of area, per hotel room, and so forth. And if a climate action roadmap like the one that I just described also is applied, you would also look at, it would also state the compliance with interim target values or any deviation from these values. So now for the final part, it's very important, of course, you can do all sorts of things, but if you don't verify and if you, if you don't verify whether you've actually achieved what you set out to do, it's pretty meaningless. So of course, that's why you would have the verification and the quality assurance, and you get then incentives for more climate action with D, G, and B certification. So now my final slide, it very much picks up on the rather depressing figures that I showed at the beginning for Germany. So ideally, what we want to get to really is through what the DGNB wants to achieve through this, the framework, but also the Klimapuls initiatives, is to get from the largest source of CO2 to becoming an integral part of the energy transition by being CO2 neutral or even operate in a positive way, and by turning buildings into real CO2 sinks. And to help market participants, there are a number of tools, a number of pieces of guidance available on the DGNB website. So you have here sort of capacity building and knowledge transfer elements that support those initiatives. So there's the, sorry, I can't read that. The toolbox, Klimaneutrales Bauen. I'm not sure whether that's also available in English, but it is worth checking out. So this is the toolbox, climate neutral consumption. And with this, I conclude my presentation and look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula, for your presentation and for that strong conclusion that the time is now to act. So we can now initiate our question and answers session. But before, I have to say that REHVA is preparing a new position paper, maybe two versions of one position paper. The first one gathering all technical details and presented also to be understood by the scientific and technical world, and the other translated in simple words in order to be understood by the political level. So this new position paper will, let's say, underline the modifications we will need to see maybe for the next revision on EPB content itself. Then another important aspect of EPBD is the transposition phase of this directive. focusing also on a common methodology for the calculation of energy performance in buildings. And then another very, let's say, vivid topic is the training and qualification. So we need experts in order to put in place everything we discuss and we, let's say, have on our tables in order to reach all targets. Okay, so if you have questions for our distinguished guests, please, we can start this session. 20 minutes, we have a short delay of 10 minutes. We can take, there is 10 minutes from the lunch break. So yes, please.
Thank you. Livia Mazzarella, Vice President of REHVA, a full professor in the University of Milan. I have a general question, which is for all speakers, let me say that, because, no, it's very easy. Because what I've seen now in all presentation, that there is a, first of all, as Jarek Kurnitski said, there's missed one important parameter, indoor air quality. Indoor environmental quality, because we can reduce to really zero energy, the energy consumption if you go back to the caves, no problem at all. But the point is not to go back to the caves. Then we have to be sure that we maintain a certain indoor environmental quality level, and I see SRI, which is maybe useful, but I don't see any indicator for indoor environmental quality. This is a very important point. The second point I would like that some of the speaker could ask is that the main confusion about total primary energy use. Because I see also that in France now we have total primary built energy, no, instead of total primary physical energy in the normal. Okay, but this is one keyword, because then people hearing total primary energy, built total primary energy, think that the total primary energy is just only the built total primary energy and so on. This is making a lot of confusion because, first of all, it's simple to show physically, that you can have two buildings with the same amount of primary energy use, which have completely different CO2 production. And because of the goal of the EPBD 1, 2, 3 is clearly stated, is CO2 production. And we are moving with the next evolution of EPBD to zero, nearly zero, net zero. We will see CO2 building. Then in that case, or emission building, in that case, it's clear that we have to work with such source of energy and conversion, which are producing CO2. And almost all renewable energy sources in their use conversion don't produce CO2, just only biomass, but then it is a so-called compensation law, etc. Then why to increase confusion to use total primary energy when we can just increase efficiency in our system? Very simple keyword, increase efficiency. That means few losses in all process and limiting, if you like to reduce the overall energy use, to work with the energy needs. We have such nice standardized keywords in standard, ISO standard today, CERN standard, energy use, and energy needs. Energy needs to just work on the envelope and so on. I just finished. That, you see, is a very large question to anyone.
So who wants to reply from the speakers? Okay, maybe replying, yeah.
In France, the fact that we use total primary energy, which is built, it's not new. It's always been the case. First remark, but I completely agree with the view that it has to be clear to everyone. And then it can also be a matter of where do you put the perimeter? Because if the PV is inside the perimeter, then no problem. But you could have other problems. But if it's inside the perimeter, it's logical. So if you put the perimeter at the level of the metering, then it makes sense completely. That was my first point. I was thinking of something else that I lost.
So, Livio, can you repeat the other questions, because it is.
Exactly the problem. Where we put the perimeter, that means we have to standardize way to that. On the other way, we will have different results. And the other problem is how you are going to calculate the primary energy factor. If you put 1 for renewables, that makes sense. Where depends where you put the boundary again. You know, that's the problem.
And I wanted to complement with the why, the history behind that. Why are we talking only about methods, builds, energy? Maybe it's historical. At the beginning, after the oil peak crisis in the 70s, the goal of all these regulations was to reduce the energy price for end consumers. So they started to work, at least in France, we have an history where we started to work with the energy price themselves. Then we switched to primary energy with primary energy factor that somehow magically reflects the ratio of gas price and electrical price. But there was always this idea in mind to reduce the invoice to the end consumer. And so this is why the link with method build energy, I think, is here also. And it's important to keep that in mind, not to lose that at some point. It has also to have a positive economical impact to the end user. And it has to be encompassed in all this regulation also. It makes it all the more complicated, I agree.
Okay, Jarek, please.
Yeah, just a short comment. I think now maybe this is a kind of improvement in the EPBD, but this boundary is better specified, and it is possible to define so where you have these energy meters in reality installed, what is indeed not following what we have in the European standards right now in the calculation, but still this is something what was not previously so clearly defined. And in this case, this French approach is completely in line with EPBD definitions. When you take a assessment boundary and the SPV is inside the assessment boundary, no problem, no need to account to the total primary energy delivered to the assessment boundary. But we need to be accurate what we mean, because this total primary energy can have also many meanings, and in EED there is one meaning, but anyhow this is very much, let's say, energy product based approach also followed in EED. But at the same time we need to account photovoltaic on the renewable energy, what is very important for the renewable energy statistics and the RED directive. So we need to make these distinctions in the calculations, but when the definitions are well set, it should not be a problem.
But the problem is that the standard is inconsistent. The picture is different from the table. In the picture, we have that the PV system, solar system, wind system are out of the assessment boundary, while we have 1 as a primary energy factor in the table. But this is a historical reason. Johan can explain, was just a mistake. Well, that's the point. We have a wrong standard, and then we have wrong law, and then we have wrong up twice squared applications.
But the standards
not very nice conclusion coming
directive
from
never is wrong. Directive by law it's right. When you can improve a standard, this is not the problem.
I have to ask the attendants if there are other questions. Yes, we have questions in the. And then yes, we saw. Yeah.
Oh, hi there, Michael Neves from ECOS, the Environmental Coalition on Standards. So first of all, we agree to get the standards right and more harmonized and get these things correctly are, of primary importance. So just to agree on that. Secondly, on I guess the main topic of this session on zero emission buildings, At the moment, the discussion on kind of efficiency is obviously extremely important for energy savings, to decarbonize the grid and decarbonize the buildings. But the way that the criteria was agreed late last month by the council includes the possibility to use energy carriers that are in no way compatible with our climate goals long term. So, I mean, a question for the Commission and maybe for ENGIE as well, potentially, how do we regain the climate credibility of the idea of zero emission buildings? Because there is no way that is credible long term. So any response, welcome.
Okay.
Two things. First, in France, I will take the French example. We have this cap on the carbon emission of the buildings. So at the end, you have to design a building, whatever the energy vector that you use, that has to be below that. So do it whatever the way you want. It's not the purpose of the regulation to put to ban or this on this vector, but in fact, what happens in the regulation in France is that for single family houses, you can forget about the boilers. So without banning the boiler itself, you reach the same result by putting this limit on the carbon emission of the building. So it works rather fine. So here we are talking about new buildings. And then it has to be implemented so I was talking about single family houses. We have a next step for collective dwellings with new thresholds in 2025, I think, which is already in the law. And at the end, it will end up also with more or less the same result. You will need a heat pump or hybrid heat pumps, basically. So the road there is rather okay. I'm talking about France. For existing building, the subject is really different. It's really different because you meet technical difficulties in various situations. And the most difficult situation, as I mentioned, the ban on fossil gas boiler, will be individual boiler in collective dwellings. So for this solution, and I know that there are different points of view, but to date, I never saw a solution that can be scaled up at the level of the entire continent. So mainly heat pump replacing individual boilers in collective dwellings. Honestly, I don't believe in it. There will be in some cases, that's not the issue, but massively for the tens of millions of dwellings there, I don't believe in that. And therefore, we have also another issue to decarbonize the energy vector, which is gas, and which will remain because of the winter peak. You won't scale size an electrical system for the winter peak for whole Europe. At some point, it doesn't make sense. And you need to decarbonize the gas vector. And this is why also we consider that the pushing for biogas that will replace the fossil gas is also an important part of the equation.
Okay, so we can take two more questions. I have also one question for the two ladies representing very important institutions today at our summit.
I have just a remark and a question for the two last speakers. The remark consists in about the regulation, French regulation. We are speaking about the all primary energy, but I think that's also important for all people that not knowing that. But we are only speaking about 5 uses when we are speaking about the French regulation of buildings. And about the electricity, that means we are speaking about domestic hot water, we are speaking about heating, we are speaking about ventilation and pumps and air conditioning and lighting. And that means about electricity, we are not speaking about mainly 60–70% of the real consumption in the real life. And this is one aspect that the French regulation is not taking into account, and maybe that's something should be taken into account for the future. My question is more about the databases for LCA, because you mentioned that it's easy to make a LCA for a new building. And my practical point of view is an experience and also a professional network is that's not easy at all, because already no database is clearly defined. The database is the one with FDES in France, so that means the CSTB put a check. In fact, we have a real problem in France now to have a huge database. And there are different databases in Europe. And in fact, this practical aspect is a problem now, currently in France. So maybe in 2 years or 3 years, I hope it will be solved. But maybe this is something we should notice in Europe, because the EPBD is going in that sense. Which database should we use? Should be European database, French database, because we are for once in advance. I don't know. And I would be also interested in the German database for DGNB. What is used, Databau or EcoInvent, or I don't know why, but we didn't discuss at all about the database, and I think that's could be a great aspect for European and REHVA filling.
Once again, no. So it was a question launched. So who do you want to answer? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, generally on data, I'll get to that point. On the data, I think there's obviously a lot of discussion around a data basis. I mean, personally, I feel that we need to start at building level and have data readily available for all types of stakeholders, including heating and cooling engineers, but also policymakers, financing institutions. And how do you do that? Because if you cannot actually, if a database cannot cater for all stakeholders involved, you will never get a whole life carbon approach, because you're not just not covering the whole life cycle. So basically you're creating data silos. So in response, so I've been working with UNEP and the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, but also with DG Growth of the Commission on development of building passports. And there are a couple of building passports initiatives in Europe. Some of them are policy-led, some of them are industry-led. But I think that would be, then you can then have aggregated data, of course, going into various databases. But I think what is really missing, and this has come from conversation with a lot of stakeholders, especially from the financial sector, is basically having a one-stop shop for data. And if you look at cars, if you look at your own kind of health insurance record, it looks at you holistically. It doesn't look at just one part of your performance or the car's performance. I know it's a very simplistic picture. So what I'd really like the Commission to do is to really progress on the development and Europe-wide adoption of building passports. Then you can actually the information that is contained in there can be drawn from other databases and can be drawn from other tools such as the EPC, so from certification, and from financial sources, and that then you have a holistic picture. You can also that would also help from a DGNB point of view. It would also help with the development of those climate action roadmaps, because you can actually draw on building data that may even predate your starting point, because you have also data from the planning processes and so forth. So that would be my take on how to deal with data. But progress is painfully slow, on this, sadly. I hope that was okay. I didn't quite answer your question, but I think we need to get away from these silo databases, because ideally we should facilitate all stakeholders to be able to be part in that process, and not just one profession. So sorry.
Okay. The question in the back of the room, yeah.
Yes, good morning, Philip Garek from GRDF. I have a question. We mentioned efficiency, but in the Energy Efficiency Directive, there is a strong push for demand-side flexibility. We would have thought that buildings will be the ideal candidate for that, because it represents a large volume, but even more for its seasonal demand. It's the only sector with such a seasonal demand due to heating. But presently, it's not very seen in. Can you hear me now? Oh, sorry. Yeah. So this flexibility in buildings is not very seeable in EPBD. When flexibility can help improve the path, because you can use the most efficient system, reduce the CO2 efficiency, improve the LCA because you can optimize with sober investments. The question is it too late to try to put a bit more focus on flexibility in buildings?
Yes. Jarek will reply to your question.
Yeah, flexibility in buildings, it's only included in the smart readiness indicator currently. And this is true that EPBD has historically operated with energy performance, and there is energy performance indicator only. There is no peak power indicators, never been in EPBD. However, yes, we as professionals have a couple of times proposed that there should be a peak power electricity indicator or something to be included, what is technically not too difficult, but currently flexibility is quite well addressed in the smart readiness indicator and this assessment scheme. However, this is not a performance-based scheme, it's based on the scoring from the catalog of installed systems in the building and the properties, but this is the only connection to the flexibility we have in EPBD currently.
Yeah, I would just like to what Jarek said, that flexibility in building design should be in the hand of the designer to choose to use, for instance, heat storage to lower the peak and so on. That can be on the building side design. The main point is the integration with the local energy, let's say, side. That means not only smart grid, but also can be local district heating, sharing of. This has been addressed by the directive, taking consideration energy communities and mainly renewable energy communities. They can share energies according to their profile, and that's flexibility. But then we need to develop such energy communities and to have such overall design of an energy site. That's the point. At the building level, it's free. Anyone can do. Any good designer can choose to have a storage. Of course, the storage is a cost. Then it's a matter of what's the tariff, if you are able or not to do that.
Thank you, Olivia, for your answer. We have a comment also from the DGNR.
Yes, thank you. So just to react on a number of points, I think there were several that connected to what is now in negotiation, and there I would say is definitely not too late. As I mentioned now with the slightly delayed calendar in the parliament side, it's really now and probably until beginning of next year that the compromise amendments of the parliament are in the making. So it's really the right moment now. And then a number of other comments related more to, okay, how to put this in practice afterwards. So regarding those on points under negotiation, so there was a comment really on the weakening of zero emission buildings that we have in the Council General approach adopted on the 25th of October. And there, I mean, for those of you who have not had the chance to have a look at this document, I would really encourage you to look at it, to see what has been really weakened there and what could be, you know, the points of attention now towards Parliament. And I would mention really two. One was already flagged by ECOS, and I hinted at it, but very briefly during my presentation, is on zero emission buildings. So there, what we have now in the general approach is definitely weaker than was in the Commission proposal. So there could be, let's say, two ways forward. I could imagine one would be that then through the Parliament position and in the subsequent trialogues, this is reinforced again, at least to some extent, or alternatively, that then is more adequately framed as what it is now, which is an on-site zero emission building definition, much more than a broader, zero emission buildings vision. So those could be a bit, two possible avenues, which would mean if we take the second, that then a revision in not too many years would need to look at this again, and possibly reinforce it further. But our aim with this revision being so comprehensive was to avoid, and a revision in just a couple of years' time, because that, of course, every time puts on hold implementation, as I was mentioning. So that does regards zero emission buildings. But another aspect which is also slightly weakened in the Council general approach has to do with indoor air quality. So that is also something that I think is very relevant. And there, regarding indicators, in the EPC, we have the mandatory ones, which are on primary energy, but also on greenhouse gas emissions. But there could be also additional voluntary indicators, and there is a push for that in the current revision. And this again could look into indoor air quality in quite some more detail. Regarding the point on demand side flexibility, I would say that in the current directive, indeed, is the smart readiness indicator the main hook. But in the revision, we also have this reference to smart charging for e-mobility that also goes in the direction of demand response and demand side flexibility. And here as well, there is, of course, the parallel work on market design that is going on, where there could be new proposals also to address some of the emergency concerns that come with the high energy prices. But from a buildings perspective, a very basic barrier is the rollout of smart meters at national level. So this, in fact, is already in existing EU legislation, but is not happening everywhere. And it's something that is quite a precondition also for buildings to be much more active actors on demand side flexibility. And then there is as well a very important link to heat loads in buildings. So it's not only electricity, of course, but that may be also an area possibly for this afternoon discussion. And then without taking, really going through all the comments, which were quite interesting, just to mention that, of course, once the text is agreed sometime in the second quarter of next year, then all the other work starts. So the update of the standards to reflect what is there in the actual text, then also guidance for transposition and implementation. So many of the other questions, let's say, which had to do more with the practical implications could be dealt with then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your answers to the questions.